Picture this, the day after Christmas. Presents are unwrapped, the holidays are starting to fade, and you're kind of settling back into normalcy.
Yeah.
But for Dawn Hackney, back in 1997, that day took a horrifying turn.
Oh, wow.
A fire ripped through her home in Breton, Washington, leaving her lifeless. It sounds like a tragic accident. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what everyone thought at first.
Right.
But you brought us some audio clips from a true crime podcast, Mortal Sin, that suggests that this might be far more complicated than a simple accident.
Yeah, it's so unsettling how quickly a seemingly open and shut case like this becomes just shrouded in doubt.
Right.
We're presented with this image of, a cozy Christmas scene,
Yeah.
wrapping paper, a space heater, battling that, Washington chill.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of details that make this tragedy feel all too relatable.
Oh, absolutely.
And then layer by layer, the podcast peels back this facade of normalcy to reveal these unsettling questions lurking beneath.
It starts with those eyewitness accounts of the fire itself.
Yeah.
We hear from a contractor, Jeffrey Richardson, who was actually in the area and saw the flames engulfing the Hackney home.
Oh, wow.
He even tried to get someone's attention, but it was too late.
Oh, no.
The fire department arrived quickly, but the damage was already done.
Wow.
They found Dawn's body in the bedroom,
Oh, my gosh.
and later her husband Nick, who was a pastor at a local church, arrived on the scene, seemingly devastated.
And initially, everything points towards a tragic accident.
Right.
The fire marshal focuses on the wrapping paper near the space heater, possibly made worse by propane bottles that were stored in the room.
Yeah.
Even Officer Sue Schultz, who was one of the first responders, found the scene consistent with an accidental fire. It seems like a heartbreaking but straightforward case.
Yeah. But as the podcast goes deeper, a crucial detail emerges that kind of throws everything into question.
Exactly. The autopsy reveals that Dawn's lungs were strangely clear of soot,
Really?
which is a very unusual finding in a fire-related death where you'd typically expect soot inhalation. Now, the coroner offered an explanation that the extreme heat could cause the throat to close up, preventing soot from entering the lungs.
Oh.
But it's this kind of detail that plants that first seed of doubt.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if the fire was truly an accident or if someone might have gone to great lengths to make it look that way.
Precisely, it shifts our focus from the physical evidence of the fire to the human element, specifically Dawn's husband, Nick Hackney.
Right.
The podcast does a deep dive into his personality, his role as a pastor, and his behavior in the wake of the tragedy.
And that's where things start to get really interesting. We hear from people in the church community, parishioners like Annette and Craig Anderson, as well as Pastor Bob Smith, who all described Nick as being remarkably composed after the fire. He even publicly blamed himself for the tragedy, attributing it to his negligence with the space heater.
Wow.
What's striking is how this initial composure is both praised and scrutinized.
Right.
On the one hand, you have people commending his strength and faith in the face of such a horrific loss.
Right.
Yet there's this subtle undercurrent of observation,
Yeah.
this unspoken question of whether his outward grief aligns with what might be hidden beneath the surface.
It's not just his reaction right after the fire that raises questions. The podcast highlights how Nick's demeanor changes so much in the weeks following Dawn's death.
Oh, really?
He goes from like this pillar of strength to someone who's so needy and dependent on the community. It's like that facade of composure just crumbles and you see a very different person underneath.
That kind of rapid shift in behavior is certainly interesting. I mean, could it be a sign of genuine grief just manifesting in unexpected ways? Or is it, as the podcast suggests, something more calculated?
That's the question that lingers throughout this whole case. The podcast goes into specific incidents that paint a rather unsettling picture of Nick's interactions, particularly with women in the church.
Right. They bring up this falling backward trust exercise that Nick used during counseling sessions. It sounds pretty standard for a youth pastor, right? A demonstration of faith, relying on others, that sort of thing.
Yeah, on the surface, yes, it's meant to build trust and show the power of belief.
Okay.
But the podcast reveals that Nick was conducting this exercise individually with Annette Anderson, a married woman, and specifically not during couples counseling with her husband.
Oh, wow.
That's where the line gets blurred.
So it's less about building general trust and more about creating this sense of intimacy and dependence on him specifically.
Exactly. It's a subtle form of manipulation,
Right.
especially within the context of a religious community where there's already this high level of trust in figures of authority.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He's taking advantage of that existing power dynamic to create a special connection with these women, separate from their husbands and families.
And it wasn't just Annette. The podcast highlights this pattern of Nick focusing his counseling efforts on women,
right,
often excluding their husbands from sessions. It's almost as if he was intentionally building a following of these devoted female parishioners.
That's a classic tactic used by abusers and manipulators, isolating their victims from their support systems, making them more dependent on the abuser. And in this context, he's leveraging the trust that's inherent in his role as a pastor to create this sense of exclusivity and specialness, all while subtly undermining their existing relationships.
It makes you wonder if Dawn was picking up on this behavior before her death.
It's certainly possible the podcast shares accounts from Dawn's friends like Eunice Cody, who noticed a change in Dawn's behavior in the months leading up to the fire. She seemed withdrawn, almost desperate to reconnect with Nick. Like she sensed a growing distance between them.
And then there's that chilling detail about Dawn's premonition.
Oh, yeah.
The night before the fire, she tells her mother, "If I were to die, I'm ready."
Wow.
It's as if she had some kind of foreboding feeling about her fate.
It's hard to dismiss that as mere coincidence, right? It makes you wonder if Dawn was aware of something amiss in her marriage. Something that made her feel uneasy or even threatened. It adds another layer of complexity to the case, raising questions about what Dawn might have known and why she felt this sense of impending doom.
The podcast also dives into the dynamics of Nick and Dawn's marriage. And it seems like there were some underlying tensions there.
Right.
Dawn was very career-driven, which contrasted with the more traditional roles of women within their church community.
That clash between societal expectations and personal aspirations is a key element here.
Right.
It's possible that Dawn's success outside the home was perceived as a threat to Nick's authority, especially within a religious community that often emphasizes traditional gender roles.
Right.
It could have fueled his need for control, creating a power imbalance within the marriage.
And it's interesting that the podcast emphasizes how Dawn was the primary breadwinner while Nick devoted his time to the church, often being away from home for extended periods.
That financial dynamic further complicates the power structure. Dawn, burdened with the responsibility of supporting them both, might have felt trapped or obligated to stay in a situation that was becoming increasingly unsettling. Meanwhile, Nick, freed from the constraints of a traditional job, had more freedom to pursue his own interests, both within and outside the church.
And then there are those cryptic warnings Nick shared with Annette about some impending doom in his future. It's almost as if he was predicting his own misfortune. But in a way that placed himself at the center of this grand, divinely ordained drama.
That's a tactic often employed by manipulators to foreshadow events in a way that garners sympathy and reinforces their position as someone special, someone chosen. It preemptively deflects scrutiny and fosters a sense of protectiveness in those around them.
Which is exactly what happened, The community, already grieving Dawn's death, rallied around Nick, interpreting her death as a confirmation of his prophecy. They saw him as a victim, a man of God enduring a terrible tragedy, rather than considering the possibility that something far more sinister might be at play.
It's a perfect example of how charisma and manipulation can blind individuals to the truth. The community, bound by their shared faith and belief system, readily accepted Nick's narrative. Further solidifying his position of power and influence, they were blinded by his charisma and their own desire to believe in his goodness, failing to see the red flags that were becoming increasingly apparent.
It's really unsettling to see how easily people can be swayed, especially when faith and trust are involved. You start to question how much of what we perceive as truth is shaped by the narratives we choose to believe.
Absolutely. And that's why these kinds of stories are so important.
Right.
They force us to confront the uncomfortable reality that manipulation can exist even in the most seemingly sacred spaces.
Yeah.
They challenge us to be critical thinkers, to question assumptions, and to be wary of those who wield power and influence regardless of their titles or positions.
So where do we go from here? We have this devastating fire, a husband whose behavior raises more questions than answers, and a community blinded by their faith in this charismatic leader.
It's a chilling reminder that manipulation can thrive anywhere, especially when it's cloaked in something as powerful as faith.
Right.
Nick Hackney, with his charisma and his position as a pastor, created an atmosphere where his actions were rarely questioned and his motives were rarely scrutinized.
And the podcast kind of leaves us with this lingering question. Did Nick actually foresee his wife's death, or was something much darker at play?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that Mortal Sin promises to explore further.
Okay.
They hint at, shocking events within the church, a deeply disturbing truth that unfolds as the investigation progresses.
Well, you've definitely made me curious. I'm going to have to listen to the rest of this podcast and see what other unsettling details emerge.
I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
This case is a fascinating study of human psychology, the complexities of faith, and the just devastating consequences of unchecked power.
It's a stark reminder that we should always be vigilant, question our assumptions, and never blindly trust those in positions of authority.
Absolutely.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. I think we've only just scratched the surface of this case.
Yeah, just the tip of the iceberg.
If you're interested in exploring this story further, we encourage you to check out the Mortal Sin podcast for yourself.
Definitely.
And as always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.